This episode of Incident Analysis is brought to you by Platinum Storage Group and Real Estate Investments. For USCFootball.com, I'm Keely Eure here with Dan Weber for Incident Analysis of Day 14 of the Todd McNair NCAA trial. Today we got to hear the live in-person testimony of Dr. Dennis Thomas. He was a former voting member on the Committee of Infractions. That was an interesting day from his testimony. Starting off, why do you think both sides called him individually?
Yeah, and they were kind of fighting over whose witness he was going to be and all of that. I would think without a doubt the NCAA wanted him here. He was a former football coach. He made clear that he was the only one on the panel that had been a former football coach. He also said, I'm a former AD, and I think I was the only one that, well, the chairman of the committee was Paul D., and that's what he was, the AD at Miami. So kind of missed on that one. And it kind of overlaid a little bit of Dennis Thomas. He's the commissioner of the MEAC, which are schools from Howard University, Delaware State, all the way down to Florida A&M, over to Grambling, and there's generally historically black colleges that are Division I. And he said something to the effect that I was the only one. And they said, why did you want to be on the committee? And he said, well, I was the only one that looked like me on the committee. And then later on, when they asked about was there any bias toward Todd McNair, he said, I understand bias. I know bias, and I would stand up against bias, causing Bruce Broillet, after lunch, to come in before the jury came back and say, you know, I'm getting a little uneasy about the fact that there's kind of been a racial tint put on this case. And he said, this is not a case about race discrimination, and let's hope that we don't go there. And I think the NCAA attorney said, well, really not. That just sort of, but said, we'll watch it as they went on. But there was a little bit of that. I think with Bruce Broillet and the NCAA, I think they wanted him on there because
you said in both the NCAA?
Oh, I'm sorry. Why Bruce wanted him on there was the good point. Was that when they first did a deposition back in 2012 for the original, anti-slap motion where they were defending it, they wanted to do. Shep Cooper and Dennis Thomas were two of the people they deposed, and they realized that 2012, as they've said, and they said in court, he couldn't remember almost anything. So they wanted to, I think, make the point, how can you make these kinds of rulings if you really don't know all the facts? And I think Dennis Thomas worked really hard to say the reason he would believe Lloyd Lake over Todd McNair were that the facts and the facts or evidence lined up with what Lloyd Lake said. And then the reason Bruce wanted him there was that he kept asking him about all the facts and all the testimony of Lloyd Lake. And Dennis Thomas could not almost remember any of it. I mean, I just don't recall. He did do a much better job answering when the NCAA was asking questions. So it's interesting. How does that play with the jury? I don't think we know.
Yeah, I'm very curious about that too. It seemed like the NCAA wanted Dennis Thomas to kind of act like a pseudo-expert as far as coaching goes, to kind of parallel or counter Todd McNair. They asked him a lot about his coaching decisions. Well, if you were a coach, what would you do with the recruit? What would you do with this? And it seemed like they were kind of using Thomas to criticize some of McNair's decisions.
Yeah, and he's got a really good, resume. I mean, here's a guy, he pointed out, I grew up in Mississippi, went to Alcorn State, was a football player there, made the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the kind of the black All-America team. Mentioned then, though, that both his mother and his grandfather graduated from Alcorn. So he was he might have been a Mississippi kid, but he was a college, in a family of college graduates. And after graduating from Alcorn and getting, a year as a grad assistant at Louisiana Monroe, he was given the opportunity to go get his doctorate, and Alcorn paid for it. And he went up to, I think he said NYU, New York, Stony Brook, I believe, is where he got his doctorate in education. Came back and became the athletic director. He was a football coach for 3 years at South Carolina State. Had 3 losing seasons and got fired, he said. And then he became the athletic director at Hampton for about, I think he said 16 years, something like that, 12 years. And then he became the commissioner of the MEAC. So, they could bring him in and say, look, he's played football, he's coached it, he's been an athletic director, he's got the kind of experience. And then, as you said, the questions they asked him were an awful lot of opinion stuff.
Yeah, it seemed like the NCAA was kind of leading him on a little bit, having him speculate about certain decisions that McNair made, whereas Thomas coached in a different era than Todd McNair, and it seemed to kind of actually get to Todd McNair a little bit, because here was this guy who was just completely judging and speculating on certain events that I don't think Thomas necessarily had the right to do so.
Yeah, the two things they went after Todd on were, well, what if you didn't, he mentioned the fact that, like, his first year coaching, the whole staff got fired. He got hired in July, got fired in December, and I said, well, what did you do? Oh, you get in your car, you just drive everywhere, you get in front of everybody, that's what you do, blah, blah, blah. And there's, clearly trying to make the case, well, Todd McNair didn't do that. And then, I think he really second-guessed Todd over the Percy Harvin recruiting night. Yeah. And how could you leave him in a hotel and you got to go? And they said, well, did you realize they had Jared Blank, that's whose job? Because he said, you have a script and you got to, have that script go. And they said, well, USC had a person, Jared Blank, who was responsible for that script. And that's why you call him. And he said, you do realize he got in touch, he said, well, why was he, calling, he kept saying calling Lloyd Lake. And they said, do you know that was the number Reggie gave him? That wasn't Lloyd Lake, he was calling Reggie. So, oh, no, he didn't know that. I said, do you know he did get in touch with Reggie? Oh, no, he didn't know that. So he was pretty specific about, he thought Todd really didn't handle that very well. And pushed hard on, he just didn't see it the way Todd saw it. He said, I would have done it that way. Now, if your only job as head coach at South Carolina State, you're probably not in the same position as a USC coach who's, some people thought he was as good as anybody in the country. But that's where trials like this go.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what made it kind of a remarkable moment when, after Dennis Thomas gave all his opinions on these things, Bruce Broillet then, in his redirect, questioned Thomas about all the facts surrounding the case, surrounding all those details, and he wasn't able to answer any of those details. It seemed like he had no memory, which begs the question, why are you so opinionated if you can't back it up with these specific details surrounding the case?
Yeah, they were asking him, how did you determine the credibility? Lloyd Lake, multiple felon, on his way back to prison, gangbanger, drug dealer, and Todd McNair. And he said, well, you line up what they said with the facts, with the evidence. And they said, well, and then Bruce started asking him about all the evidence and all the testimony, and he didn't know any of it. I mean, he did not remember. He remembered one thing he remembered was he thought there was a picture of Reggie Bush with his car, his tricked up, souped up, he called it a couple of times, car on the cover of a magazine. And Bruce said, well, you do remember that happened in November after Reggie Bush left. Months earlier, Reggie Bush was already a professional, and the magazine paid for all the tricked up, souped up, whatever, on that car. And so he didn't know that, but he had really strong opinions about how all the evidence lined up backing Lloyd Lake. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. I don't know. I think, McNair's attorneys could have gone after him harder. And they're not second guessing. I think it's a decision on their part not to do that, to just go after him to show that he really doesn't probably know enough facts to even be talking about any of this or have an opinion, whether Lloyd Lake's credibility lined up with the evidence if you don't know any of the evidence. I mean, he couldn't explain the phone call. That there's not anybody on the P who doesn't know the details of the phone call. I mean, we've got literally thousands of people out there who could tell you everything about that phone call, and he couldn't I don't know that he could tell you anything about that phone call. That's where we are.
Well, that's what I'm curious about, because it almost seemed like the NCAA kind of used Dennis Thomas as an agent of disinformation, if you will. He kind of muddied the waters about the facts, and I'm curious about the jury. If you're the jury, are you at this point in the trial where you're familiar with the facts that have been said already, or is this kind of making the picture a little muddy, not as clear as what we've seen earlier?
I think we don't know. People who've had loads of experience say that juries don't like it when they keep hear somebody keep saying, I don't recall, or if they have somebody who says that for much of the day, but then when they get a friendly questioner, they seem to recall everything. That was an interesting juxtaposition, because I don't know that he almost ever said I don't recall to a question that was asked by the NCAA.
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting testimony for sure. But that wrapped up most of the day. The last, 30 minutes, 20 minutes of the day, we got to hear from Greg Sankey. It was a video deposition. He's the SEC Commissioner. What were they trying to get at with that deposition?
Well, they asked him about, all the schools in the SEC, the 14 schools, and, you make it clear this is the powerhouse of college football, and they have a new rule in the SEC that if you're a coach, you're guilty of unethical conduct, and any one of those 14 universities wants to hire you, the president or the chancellor has to have a direct conversation with Commissioner Sankey in order to kind of justify why are you hiring somebody like that. And I think the point is being made, obviously, that if one of those schools wanted to hire Todd McNair, it would be very hard for him to be hired because of what the NCAA, found with regard to Todd. So we only saw about half of the deposition today, but clearly that's the direction they're heading, is if the SEC believes this and put it into its own bylaws, isn't that kind of the general rule in college sports? Because the NCAA, most of this trial has been saying, hey, that's no big deal. 1 year show cause. Hey, guys, all the time. We've, many worse penalties. Today, Dennis Thomas called it a minuscule penalty. Just like it didn't even matter. So, it's just a matter of how people are using words and what they're trying to, convey. And Dennis Thomas was another one who said, those guys, who weren't supposed to deliberate, well, they did a lot of stuff, but did they really deliberate? And, I don't exactly recall. He couldn't recall any of the emails they sent, even if they, had his name on the address line, and he would say, I remember it now that we were getting ready for this trial, but do I remember it? No. But he said he read everything for the case. So, he didn't have the ability. This is one more NCAA witness who does not have the ability to say who wrote the final decision and when did they write it. And he just, gave you that kind of blank stare. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't know how that happened.
Yep. Going forward, we got a little bit of a better schedule, what's going to go forward. It sounds like Friday we're going to hear the closing arguments for the whole day, and then jury deliberations would start that following Monday. Do you think that this is doable? Does that sound right to you?
And then we heard that maybe even before Friday to get them started. I don't know if they want to split them up. I think they were talking about, give each one of them half the day Friday. Not knowing enough about these trials, and you don't always get a chance to ask anybody as they're running out of there. It's just not really done. But would that be the way you do it? Have the final, closing arguments all day Friday and then dismiss them for the weekend and say come back Monday?
Yeah,
I don't know. It would seem like it'd be harder to remember Monday coming back. So I don't think, and they haven't talked about exactly what they would do with the jury, but they've certainly tried to make it clear that they're dang on well going to try to finish by the end of the day Friday.
Yep. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for day 14 of the Todd McNair NCAA trial. For Dan Weber, I'm Keely Eure. For more, check out uscfootball.com.